Good afternoon, everyone. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak with the group here today. And as Fred mentioned, going to be talking about this year's new crop corn silage, but also probably get into some other forages a little bit. But just to try to look at the outlook over the next year with the feeding of this year's crops that we put up. Like I mentioned, first off, we'll primarily touch on corn silage and looking at the 2022 crop, which we've seen through the lab thus far, and kind of compare it to what the historical data, 3-year data through the lab. And then I'll touch briefly on alfalfa haylage, what we've seen for the 2022 crop and compared to historical data. And then lastly, some of the alfalfa grass mix data that we can go through. So the first slide here I'd like to share is this slide came from Dr. Bill Weiss at Ohio State, talking about the partitioning of energy coming from corn silage. Kind of the main reason I like to share this one is it really brings the point, what are the big values in corn silage, right? 42% of the energy coming from starch content and 31% of the energy coming from NDF. So that's kind of the big take home point of this slide is, why corn silage has been a growing component and such a large component of a lot of dairy diets and other diets for that matter. But, the take home there is NDF and starch are the big components and what they bring to the diet. Right here, I'll kick into what we're seeing here through the lab for the 2022 crop here in this column versus the historical data 2019 through 22. I guess first off, looking at the moisture contents, not much of a change from last year, from previous data to new crop. Protein contents are pretty similar, just the uptick of a 1/10 of a point there. NDFOM, so total fiber contents just down just a touch from 37.2 down to 36.9. NDF digestibility, just a slight downturn in NDF digestibility, but really in the big picture, not a huge change from previous historical data. UNDF 240, UNDF 240 is that undigestible NDF. Seems like more and more nutritionists and dairies using that as a marker for the total diet or, marker for ranking corn silage or forages in general. Just a slight uptick in UNDF 240, which would be inverse to the NDFDs really. So that kind of is in line with what the NDFD 30s did there. A slight uptick in starch content, like I previously mentioned there, obviously starch and NDF are the two big nutrients that we kind of focus in on the most because that's what's really what corn silage is bringing to the diets for the most part. Fat, of course, fat is not a huge component in corn silage, but it could be obviously a contributor with the fat content you can get in the kernels, but 2.2, we had no change from historical data to new crop. And then the ash contents went down slightly from historical data at 4.3 down to 3.9 here on new crop. So not a huge change, but it went in the right direction. I think last year or some of this historical data, we tended to see maybe a little more soil contamination that elevated some of those previous years' data as a whole. And then lastly here, milk per ton, the milk per ton energy equation. I know a lot of people like to look at that as an index, bringing all the energy into one number to compare varieties. It doesn't have a lot of utility in balancing diets, of course, but it certainly brings everything into one number. So looking at the previous 3 years data, the milk per ton was 34.56 compared to 2022 data, the median of 3,500 pounds of milk per ton of dry matter silage. Nextly, breaking it down into Iowa-specific samples here. So we're comparing the Iowa 2022 corn silage samples versus all of our 2022 data. And you kind of go down through the same nutrients here. Moisture was exactly the same. One thing, the Iowa samples did have a slight uptick of 0.3, 8.3 versus 8. So a little higher protein. But kind of focusing in on the NDF and starch here, slightly lower NDFs on the Iowa samples, but really not a huge difference. Slight uptick in NDFD versus our total data. So that's good for the Iowa samples there. And the UNDF was very similar there again. Starch, slight uptick in starch from 38, 34.8 on the Iowa samples versus our total database of new crop samples at 34.4. There again, the fat contents are same, and the ash is very similar. Lastly, comparing that milk per ton index, obviously very similar 3503 versus 3500. So virtually one and the same. I think the uptick in NDFD kind of washed out some of the other differences to make that. Obviously, that made the milk per ton slightly higher, but not a huge number higher there. Next year, I wanted to compare Iowa 2022 samples versus a year ago when we did this and presented the 2021 data to give you more relevance to the Iowa samples directly. Moisture contents were very similar versus samples we saw from last year in Iowa. Here again, back to the protein, slight uptick on the protein in this year's samples. NDF is actually down about 1.7 versus last year's samples. I think last year's samples out of Iowa were slightly higher in NDF versus our total database, but the NDFDs were higher last year in Iowa samples. So that's one difference versus our total database of samples are actually, so that was part of the difference there. And then a slight uptick in the UNDF 240 again, but then here about a point uptick in the starch contents. And then you get down to the bottom line, your milk per tons are actually up slightly with the 2022 crop samples. I think that uptick in starch kind of offset the NDFD going down. So really dependent on what your diet needs, of course, are, whether it's, most diets need some combination of starch and NDF digestibility. It's certainly higher starch silage might fit in certain diets better than others, of course. Moving along here. So here's the same 2022 corn silage data versus our historical samples, but then I broke out here just BMR specific or brown midrib specific samples and looking at the 2022 samples versus the historical BMRs and then comparing versus the total database of corn silages. I guess in general, the BMRs, they tend to be a little higher in moisture when they're harvested. I think part of that is just the fact that there's probably more progressive farms growing BMRs versus the total database of corn silage. Maybe some of that's put up for beef cattle or heifer lots and things like that. So it's not a huge difference, but it is a difference. The moisture contents being a little bit higher on the BMRs. Protein very similar across the board. NDF contents is another difference here with the NDFs tend to be a little higher with your BMRs, but of course you're on the NDFDs. Your NDF digestibilities are significantly higher than the average corn silages, about 7 points higher than our total database of corn silages. And then of course, inverse to that, the UNDFs or undigestible NDF is down about 2 points versus the total database on UNDFs, which is pretty typical on the average BMR sample. And then inverse to, being the NDFs are higher, the starch is typically a little bit lower with BMRs. So we're about 1.5 lower on your starch contents on the BMR corn silages versus our total database for corn silages. Fat contents very similar. There again, ash contents are down from a year ago, or down from the historical samples, which is good, but very similar to the total database of samples. And then lastly, again, looking at the milk per ton index, obviously we want to see as high a milk per ton index as possible. So those BMRs are showing about 200 pounds more milk per ton on the average versus the total corn silage database, and a little bit higher than the historical samples there. Here's just a slide with some of the distributions here on some of the major nutrients in the corn silage. Yeah, obviously protein isn't a huge component in corn silage, but we do see a range of, typically around that 6 to 9.5 covers most of your protein values in your typical corn silages, with the brunt of the corn silage being somewhere in that 7 to 8 range. Back on focusing on one of the bigger components, starch, obviously most of the starch contents in corn silage range from 20 to 45, with your mean or your averages being in the mid 30s. And then of course NDF, there again, you're in that similar range, 25 to 45, 50 NDF, with most of the samples falling somewhere between, in that mid 30s range. So pretty similar, really. Starch on average is in the mid 30s, and NDF is in the mid 30s for the most part. And then lastly, UNDF, the distributions of UNDF 240 that we typically see on corn silage of 6 to around 13, 14, with most of them falling somewhere in that 8, 9, 10 range. Here's a slide I just wanted to, kind of hammering on the in vitro starch digestibility. So IVSD7 stands for in vitro starch digestibility at 7 hours of digestion. And I like this slide, just demonstrating really the importance of letting the crop ferment to get the most out of your starch and starch availability. So all these green little dots are individual corn silage samples, and the brown line is our average 7-hour starch value over time. So this is going back last fall when we began seeing all these new crop, fresh, unfermented corn silages that are down here in the 40s and 50s for 7-hour starch. And then once you see a majority of this crop, or a bigger majority of the crop fermented, you obviously see this nice slope up, and then it kind of levels off as the year goes on for that 7-hour starch digestibility value. Obviously the whole year we kind of see a small sprinkling of samples that are low digestibility of starch, but obviously we want to focus in on making sure we're feeding well fermented corn silage, so we're getting the most out of our starch as we can. We don't want that in our manure, of course. Here another slide on focusing in on that IVSD7, or in vitro starch digestibility at 7 hours. Last year, we broke down the samples that came in between September and November 21 versus this year's samples, September through November 22. The median IVSD7 value is very similar as last year. And last year, if you remember, this was down slightly from the 2020 data, but we have a huge range, minimum of 55, 56, all the way up to 80, and there again, those samples that are in that 75, 80 and over are most likely still samples that were fermented for over a year, whereas these ones that are down in the 50 to 60 range are unfermented, early fermenting samples that not going to get the bang out of that starch that you would like. Here's a nice slide that I like to share. We updated our CSPS data, corn silage processing scores. And so this is going back all the way to 2012 through current. And again, this black line is the trend line. So basically the average CSPS score over time. So the CSPS score is basically a measurement of the percent of starch passing the 4.75 millimeter screen in that CSPS methodology. Obviously, like I say, seeing this trend line going up, the industry's done a very nice job of improving, awareness of making sure that kernels are getting processed well. But of course, too, the equipment has gotten better and better over time with better processors. So really that median and average value is almost touching 70 is kind of the goal to be optimum. And that green dash line is where that 70 comes across. And we're almost hitting that with the average sample now. Certainly there are still samples down here where we don't like to see them in the 40s and 50s. So there's still some potential improvement to be gained there. Obviously particle size is a big deal when it comes to starch availability. This slide is just a little bit different way to demonstrate. This is our distribution that we see through the lab for corn silage processing scores for the 2021 and 22 crop years. So again, this green area is the optimally processed corn silage, so the samples that are over 70 CSPS score or kernel processing score. This blue area would be the samples that are considered adequate, meaning they're 50 to 70% their CSPS score. But then here are the samples that are below 50 that are considered inadequate processing. So still there's obviously some samples that are still inadequately processed. And really, like I was mentioning, the industry is, this whole distribution has been moving in the right direction, which is good. Moving along, talking about dairy fecal starch, obviously that's kind of a measurement of how much starch or corn is coming through in the manure. And as time goes on, we definitely see more and more samples coming through the lab for fecal analyses, both fecal or both starch and other components. But this kind of is depicting the dairy fecal starch over time, going back again to 2012 through current. The green line is the trend line. So we see a nice downtrend here from 2018. It looked like we had a little rougher year right in that area for a little higher fecal starches on average, but it's kind of trended down, which is a good trend to see. Obviously, we don't want starch in the manure, but we are still seeing there are some concerning samples that do come through the lab where we have significant starch in the manure. Here's just kind of the normal distribution of fecal starch samples that we see through the lab. And this includes kind of the UW interpretation guidelines that came out years ago. So the green area is samples that are less than 3% fecal starch. The gray area is 3 to 5, and over 5, kind of the interpretation was to investigate individual feeds to figure out where that fecal starch was coming from. So obviously there's still, like I say, there's still a fair amount of samples that come over 5% fecal starch. But in general, obviously a bigger majority of the samples are coming in less than 3, and really as time goes on, the goal would be as close to 0 as you possibly could get, right? But that's kind of headed in the right direction, but obviously there's still samples that or herds that might be having challenges with starch digestibility. Well, I kind of hammered on starch and fiber long enough there with corn silage, but one of the common questions we get is, what are we seeing on mycotoxins in the new crop? And I just kind of put together a slide on vomitoxin specifically, because that seems like the most common one that gets talked about quite a bit on corn silage and corn grains and such. And here I broke down what we're seeing so far vomitoxin levels in the new crop samples for corn silage. Broke it down to samples that are non-detectable or less than 0.1 ppm, 0.1 to 0.5, 0.5 to 1, 1 to 2.5, 2.5 to 6, and then over 6. And just kind of showing the distribution, what percent of samples are following into those ranges. And when I compared this to previous years, we still are seeing a fair percentage of samples here in some concerning ranges of vomitoxin, but it is down from, say, last year's crop. Last year's crop, we were having over 5% of the samples over 6 ppm. So I just wanted to point out, obviously we have some samples that are non-detect and some samples that are probably considered safe, but just wanted to point out that, might be a consideration to keep in mind that there are some samples that are concerning with vomitoxin, but certainly not the worst year for vomitoxin. Well, that kind of finishes up my slides on corn silage, and we'll move along here to alfalfa haylage on what we're seeing for 2022 crop year versus the historical data. So for moisture contents, obviously they're very similar to corn silage, not much movement from old crops to this year's new crop in that 56-57% moisture range. Protein, we see a slight uptick. Obviously, protein is a bigger player here with alfalfa haylage versus previously talking about corn silage. So that's a nice trend. I mean, it's not much of a trend, but it's still a trend upwards with crude protein. NDFOM, our fiber contents, down just a small tick there. NDFD, we're seeing a slight uptick on the new crop samples, going from 48.5 up to 49.1. So a small good trend there. UNDF 240, of course, inverse to NDF digestibility. We see a small downward trend, 16.7 down to 16.5. So that's, like I said, it's a small change, but a change in the right direction. Ash contents, certainly that's with crops like hay crops. Obviously, ash is a player, and we didn't see much change here. Obviously, 11.1 to 11.1, so no change. But I think in general, the industry's doing a better and better job being aware of potential ash issues in our hay crop forages. Moving along here, a lot of people obviously like to look at RFE and or RFQ on your hay crop forages. We just saw a slight uptick in the median RFV values versus the historical data, going from 151 to 152. And kind of same goes here for the RFQ, very similar, but headed in a positive direction, 160 up to 162. Now breaking it down more regionally with your Iowa 2022 samples here compared to our total database, just slightly lower moisture contents, an upward tick with the Iowa samples being 21.7 on your crude proteins. NDF, just a slight downtick, just 0.1 difference there from a 36.3 to a 36.2. Kind of very similar across the board. Last year, I think we saw more differences here too with the Iowa samples versus our total database. But this year in general, obviously pretty similar. RFVs, 150 versus 152. RFQs, 163 versus 162. We're kind of in a pretty similar range there. But if anything, obviously seeing a positive there with the protein, and positive here with the RFQ being that the your NDFDs and the NDF, they're kind of in combination. And then here I again broke down the Iowa 2022 samples and compared to last year's 21 samples when we looked at this. So here again, we're seeing a little less moisture content, which is probably good, seeing less maybe those high-end moisture samples that can cause fermentation problems. Seeing that slight uptick in the protein again, which is good. NDF's very similar. NDFD, we see about a half point uptick, which is good. And UNDF, just a slight downtick there. ASH, very similar. And then again, getting to our indexes, the RFV and RFQ in a very similar realm again. Here's our distributions on some of your major nutrients in the alfalfa haylage. Looking at the 2022 crop versus the 3-year data. Yeah, obviously the distributions are very similar. Being we cover such a huge geography with samples coming in from all over the country. Obviously protein, like I mentioned, is a bigger player with our alfalfa haylages. We typically see somewhere around 16 up to 26 covers most of the samples, and then that average or medians falling in that 20 to 22 range for the majority of the samples. The NDF contents, most of the samples are going to be covered somewhere in that 27 to 46 NDF, with the median and averages, the majority of the samples falling in that 32 to upper 30s range for NDF contents. NDF D30s, most of the samples are going to be somewhere between mid 30s to 60% NDFD. Whereas those, the high end NDFDs, most of those samples we would see typically on your early and late crops. So your first cuttings and fourth or fifth cuttings, we tend to see the higher NDFDs. But on your average and median here, most of them are falling in that 45 to 50 range on the NDFD 30s. And then UNDF 240s, kind of the distribution, most of the samples fall 10 to about 24%. Obviously, you get into that 24% UNDF, that's some pretty woody stuff and indigestible alfalfa, whereas on this low end is some pretty rocket fuel type alfalfa. But like I say, majority of the samples are falling in that 15, 16, 17 UNDF range. So lastly, we'll move on here to some of the alfalfa mix, grass mix haylage data, and comparing the 2022 crop versus 19 through 22. Again, moisture contents really don't change a whole lot. Protein sees a slight downtick. Your NDF contents actually see a slight uptick. But I think, like I mentioned last year, it does seem like in some of our database, we are tending to see some more mixes coming in as time goes on. And my point being with that is that I think some of these mixes, we're seeing more grass coming into some of these mixes, a larger percentage of grass, which is, I think part of this reason is you see this uptick in NDF. It's not a huge uptick, but it is an uptick in NDF, but we also see an uptick in the NDFDs. So there you kind of see it down here, that offset, your RFV slightly went down versus the historical, but the RFQ held in there since the NDFD went up. So all in all, really not much for changes there. Then breaking out the Iowa samples. Keep in mind here, when I was looking at breaking out the Iowa samples for alfalfa grass mixes, it was pretty limited data. I think it was only 121 samples that I found that came out of Iowa that were classified as alfalfa grass mix. So this is very limited data. So we do see some larger differences here in the Iowa samples versus all samples through all of our labs. So I would take it with a little bit of a grain of salt that this is pretty limited data. And I do think that even these samples from Iowa are probably even more slanted more heavily to heavier grass, because number one, we see significantly lower protein, 17.5 versus 19.4. And then here again, we see higher NDFs of 43 versus 40. But here we see a little bit of offset of that higher NDF with a higher NDF digestibility. And then, so taking that into the calculations again of our indexes, obviously that was significantly lower RFV, going from 137 to 126. but some of that NDFD did keep us from falling off on those RFQs. But I think the big take-home point, this is fairly limited data, and I do think this is probably heavier towards the grass end on these particular samples. But like I say, it is pretty limited number of samples on this forage category for us. Here I'll break out again the Iowa 2022 alfalfa grass mixes versus last year's data out of Iowa that we looked at. I think last year we had a few more samples in this category for whatever reason, but I think, like I say here again, we see this downturn in the protein, upturn in the NDF, but the upturn in the NDFD, where that's why I think that the sample volume is pretty limited here, and more heavily biased or weighted towards grasses in for whatever reason out of those 120 samples that we saw this year so far. So I guess with that, I think I've kind of finished up kind of the data that I had here to share today. And I think we can open it up for some questions if we have any questions. Or
Absolutely. We're a small group. Eric, if you want to unmute your mic, if you've got a question. Otherwise, I'm going to start with a question. If you can go back to that slide where we showed the components in the alfalfa, there we go. It looks to me like we're getting better quality alfalfa. We're getting a higher crude protein, but our outliers are getting fewer. We have fewer at the 17% and 15%, but we're certainly, am I interpreting that right?
Oh, I would say yes. We definitely have a tighter, yeah, I didn't do the distributions for like the alfalfa mix, but obviously with the mix, with the grasses in there, we're going to see a wider distribution, whereas straight alfalfa haylages, we do tend to see, but I think, like you say, to your point, I think the industry is doing a better job getting alfalfa put up, so we're seeing more of these high quality, more consistent quality on alfalfa. Well, and then this year too, we saw a lot of samples get put up this fall after corn silage. With the fall, we had a really nice fall, and there were certain geographies where we were getting some pretty nice alfalfa samples coming in this fall. So that was good.
Especially in our alfalfa forages, what is the range of ash? I mean, are there some really low and some that really knock the bucket up?
Right. I think, yeah, I don't know the for sure range, but I'm sure the range is going to be covered for the most part somewhere between, I would say majority of the samples are going to be 8 to 14 would cover most samples, but those outliers that get over 14 are the ones that are getting a little challenging, right? Because when you're getting over 14,
yeah, they're going to be heifer hay or steer hay or something. Yeah,
right. Yeah, you got a lot of soil contamination when you're getting to that level, I think, for the most part. Certainly there's some alfalfas that get pretty high in potassium as well that would play into that total ash content, but typically when you're getting that high, you're getting fairly significant soil contamination.
Yeah. I've got one more question that came in when we were talking about some of the variability and the low numbers for our grasses. Is that because Iowa tends to have some lower quality grasses? So they're looking at some bromes, or compared to the eastern part states?
Yeah, like I say, I would take that with a grain of salt because it is very limited sample volumes, and Yeah, it's probably some of that. I mean, maybe a higher percentage of those samples out of that 120 samples that I found very well could have been more from, say, um, beef situations versus dairy quality situations would be. I would I would bet that that would explain a lot of that. But like I said, just 120 samples is very limited. So to get a normal distribution, I just don't feel like that's a normal distribution just because it's so different from um, well, again, okay, so yeah, here's the slide, even comparing the Iowa samples versus last year's, this is quite a difference. So I
Yep.
really don't, I just think it's just not enough samples to give us um, a good, a good take on what truly is out there for Iowa quality. Because I mean, you look at the quality of the straight alfalfa samples out of Iowa, or, if anything, they're a touch better than our total database. So
Yep.
um, I just think that it's probably of those 120, I think it's probably weighted towards higher grass and maybe more mature grass that's going to beef versus dairy would be my guess.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience?
I was just curious on the breakdown between BMR and traditional silage. What do you think the ratio is, or what percent of the market is brown midrib?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Well, part of that question, I don't know what the actual percentage of the market is.
Oh,
The percentage of samples that we get through the lab that are actually labeled BMR. So that's the next thing. I mean,
oh,
I'm
okay.
only quantifying these ones that are in this BMR area on my summary, or our summary, I should say, are samples that were labeled as BMR and they're known BMR. So,
Okay.
but we also know there's got to be some unidentified BMRs that are coming in that we just don't know for sure that they're BMRs, but they
Okay.
fall in as a conventional
Sure.
just because we don't know for 100% fact. So
Yep.
that's part of it. So I guess
Okay.
long story short, if we calculated the percent of BMR versus non-BMR that we get through the lab, it probably wouldn't really truly represent,
Sure.
the percentage out in the field just because of lack
Right.
of identification on the samples.
Sure. Okay.
Um, you bet. Good question.
Thank you.
You bet.
I've
What?
got one more question then. When we were talking about fecal starch, you know, 5 and above, we say, okay, we got to look to see what's going on there. Do we think that we're going to move that line to 3 and above? Is that probably more beneficial as a consultant to, if it's above 3, you best be looking for something?
I would agree with that. Like I say, these interpretations when they came out of, like I say, they came out of University of Wisconsin, and they are. I mean, I'm not knocking on the interpretations, but they are older interpretations. So they're from back in the day when uh, higher fecal starches were maybe more normal, back before a time when we did a better job processing corn silage, probably back before a time when we processed our dry corn or processed our high moisture corn well. Um, so there's so many factors that probably went into how this interpretation got put together years ago. But yes, long story short, I would agree with you. This metric, if I was still doing nutrition work, yeah, if it's over 3, I would want to investigate, because obviously that much starch in the manure is still a lot of dollars, and both dollars in corn just going through in the manure, but also missing out on dollars with feed efficiency, with that starch just taking up room in the diet. So, um, yeah, to me, I think a reasonable goal would be to get in that 2 range, really. But certainly, I think I would agree with you that over 3 would be a good point to be investigating further for sure.
Very good. Any other questions? Oh,
Nope.
okay. Neal, thank you very much. Always interesting to see the data from one year to the next, and we appreciate how you interpret it and help us understand what we're looking at.